Lured into service because soldiering was basically the only real means of upward social mobility left in most corners of the empire, the men who served in the army lived and retired and died in the provinces within which they served. By this point, the only thing dividing legionary from auxiliary was training, equipment, and pay. The only Italians who even contemplated service in the legions were the poorest of the poor looking for a way out of their wretched poverty, and ambitious aristocrats who were looking to pad their resumes with a year or two of military experience before settling into their comfortable public careers. But even here, the number of Italian nobles who went down that road was dwindling by the day. Most of the ambitious aristocrats left these days were themselves provincials, albeit rich provincials, who were, like Trajan or Hadrian, looking to gain entrance into the imperial power structure. The Romans were, for the most part, content to let others do the heavy lifting for them, while they frittered away their aimless lives and sent the wealth of an empire their forefathers had won for them down the drain of their vomitoriums. Am I getting carried away? Okay, I'm getting carried away a little bit. But only in that vomitoriums, as we popularly conceive of them, didn't really exist in ancient Rome. To set the stage, then, for the next evolutionary step of the empire, from Augustus's principate to Diocletian's dominate, I'm going to spend the next couple of episodes exploring how the empire, its citizens, subjects, culture, and economy were constituted during the age of the Antonines. Hopefully, then, we'll all have a much richer understanding of how and why imperial Rome stagnated, calcified a century later. Plus, all of this stuff is just intrinsically interesting. As was the case throughout Roman history, the most important thing to understand about the empire is that it was defined by gross inequality. Inequality on a scale that would make Ayn Rand blush. To put it mathematically, the Roman economic classes were divided on a logarithmic rather than an arithmetic scale. To describe it accurately, you basically start with a vast horde of poor citizens and go up from there. 10 times richer than the poor was a group 10 times smaller that could be defined as lower middle class, though the only obvious benefit of their higher annual income was that they did not qualify for any state welfare, and thus wound up struggling just as mightily as the poor to stay afloat. 10 times richer than this lower middle class was a much smaller group who we might consider upper middle class, wealthy enough to live a comfortable life and qualify for equestrian status, but nonetheless politically and economically dwarfed by the exponentially larger treasuries of the senatorial class. The minimum annual wealth requirement for admission into the senatorial order was 1 million sesterces, orders of magnitude from the 20,000 sesterces it took to simply exist on a daily basis, but at first glance, not much more than the 400,000 it took to qualify as an equestrian. But at second glance, there was, as Pliny the Younger pointed out, a vast gulf amongst the senators themselves. Pliny reckoned himself worth somewhere around 20 million sesterces, and he explicitly denied that he was a, quote, rich man. The richest of the rich, the men who would actually describe themselves as such, were a handful of senators worth 100 million sesterces or more. In the hands of these men lay the real power of Rome. To put this all another way, it has been calculated that during the reign of Trajan, only 150,000 of the 1.2 million people living in Rome lived free and independent of public charity, and of those, only a few dozen could hope to wield any economic or political influence. The rest were trapped between the teeming masses and super elite. On the one hand, comfortable in their bourgeois lifestyles, on the other, politically impotent. But of course, above them all was the emperor, whose fortune dwarfed the richest of the rich, a fact delighted in by the middle class, whose feelings of impotence were somewhat mitigated by the fact that even the super-rich themselves controlled what amounted to an imperial rounding error. By the 2nd century, the combined weight of imperial holdings and personally inherited fortunes allowed an emperor to act with the impunity that defined his position. Some of this fortune was ruthlessly obtained. Nero, for example, confiscated the 6 largest estates in the province of Africa, making him and his successors the de facto landlords of practically the whole of North Africa. Some extracted in hard-driven business arrangements. For example, imperial leases to mine in Spain were obtained with the proviso that half the output went into the imperial treasury, and some was simply obtained personally by the emperor and withheld from the state books, as with Trajan's Dacian treasure trove and Augustus's personal claim on Egypt. This incalculable imperial fortune was, as they say, the real power behind the throne. We often speak of the emperor's authority resting mostly on the backs of the legions he controlled, but of course, their loyalty was secured only by an increasingly generous series of pay increases, donatives, and bonuses. In the end, it was the privy purse, more than the sword and shield, that secured the emperor's power. So when it comes to drawing a graph of the social and economic classes in Antonine Rome, the line runs barely above zero most of the way, before sharply spiking up through the equestrians and senators on its way to the emperor, whose singular position approached infinity. Running alongside the economic class structure of free citizens were the slaves who served them all. Slavery had always been, and would always be, the bedrock upon which Roman economic life was built, and the age of the Antonines was no different. Though, as I said last week, the Romans had been trending towards more humane policies, slavery was never going to be a picnic for anyone. A few educated slaves attached to very wealthy houses lived comfortable lives and wielded very real power and influence, but the vast majority of those in bondage worked the massive estates owned by the aristocracy, or were sent to the mines, a virtual death sentence. In between these two extremes, slaves served families and businessmen of every social and economic class as cooks, maids, nurses, barbers, secretaries, messengers, accountants, stable hands, really any job beneath the dignity of a free citizen, which turned out to be most of them. It is very difficult to estimate how many slaves lived in the empire at any given time, but working with the same population figure of 1.2 million or so for Rome, about 400,000 of those were probably slaves, making the ratio of free to slave something like 2 to 1, which, as you can imagine, left the Romans in constant fear of a great slave revolt, a distressingly plausible scenario that led to more than one sleepless night. New slaves were created in one of three ways. By far the largest segment were prisoners of war. Men, women, and children caught up in the nets of the legions following their latest conquest. When I've said in the past that after this or that battle, the Romans went plundering and carried off anything that wasn't nailed down, that included the people themselves. Slave trading was a lucrative business, and a soldier could often hope to turn a better profit selling off a family he had held at sword point than he could their shiny valuables. And when I said that there were civilian camp followers who traveled along with the legions on campaign, slave traders were right there front and center, ready to take the captives off the soldiers' hands in exchange for cash. The second method of enslavement came from a law dating back to Romulus himself that allowed a father to sell his children into slavery. Obviously, by the days of the empire, this was a practice long out of fashion, but it was there and in desperate times did still happen. The last method was to be born of a female slave. Though this happened more often than the sale of free children, slave populations, the circumstances of their captivity, which often precluded romance, but also because if a man and woman could find the time and opportunity to engage in romance, damning their unborn children to slavery was a moral hurdle that they were often unable to clear. Better to wait it out and see if one or the both of them could attain their freedom before bringing children into the world. This meant that slave stocks in the age of the Antonines, while immense, were dwindling. While the Third Jewish War helped, Trajan was really the last emperor to pump up the supply, and he was a generation in the grave when Antoninus took over. Hence, it would seem, laws designed to protect the well-being of the existing slave population, so necessary to how the economy functioned. Throughout Roman history, slaves were seen not just as useful tools, but also as living status symbols for their masters. This is why, amongst the wealthiest families at least, the division of labor amongst slaves was taken to absurd extremes. One slave was designated to help a master with his daily dressing, another assigned to handle formal occasions, another for military uniforms, a fourth for dress military uniforms. One slave to deliver dinner plates, another to take them away. one slave to open the door to guests, another to escort them inside, a third to sit them down. The point was not that all of these tasks couldn't be performed by a single slave, but rather, look at how many slaves I have. In a culture that never really went in for fancy furniture, or dishes, or art, and even the largest homes in the city were of modest size due to space constraints, the abundance of slaves was the one visible way to show off wealth. This absurd and ego-driven labor redundancy was mocked endlessly, but wealthy families were nonetheless forced to worry about a dangerous slave gap opening up that might render them socially inferior to their neighbor. At the lower end of the social spectrum, the labor redundancy was not as evident, but still, a middle-class man would be embarrassed to show himself in public without at least a handful of slaves surrounding him. And Juvenal remarked that if a defendant showed up for trial and his lawyer arrived with fewer than 8 slaves in tow, he could be pretty well assured that he was going to lose the case. Basically, the modern equivalent of a polyester-clad shyster arriving to take on an Armani-clad corporate lawyer. The slaves owned and paraded around by their masters were treated with varying degrees of respect and gentleness, but by the 2nd century, treatment generally skewed towards that of a well-liked pet in the city and a respected pack animal in the country. Masters who kicked and beat their slaves, or did not take care of them when they were sick, were as much reviled as a rotten pet owner is today. The greatest love a master could show for his slave, though, was not to give him or her a soft bed and good food. It was to set them free. Manumission, as the freeing of slaves was called, became by the 2nd century a practice much in vogue. Unlike modern slavery, where freed slaves were a microscopic exception to the rule of lifetime bondage, Roman slaves could reasonably hope that if they served their masters well, that at some point they would be set free. Beyond the spontaneous freedom that was often declared by masters on special circumstances, or as the patriarch neared death, many slaves were allowed to earn and save money during their time in service, with the aim of eventually purchasing their freedom. During Augustus's time, the freeing of slaves started to become a badge of honor among the upper classes, leading to a generosity arms race that needed to be closed by the emperor before every slave in the empire was freed. So Augustus set limits both on the minimum age a slave could be free, 30, and how many slaves a master could free at one time, 100 per 500 slaves. But the freeing of slaves remained common practice, leading to the rise of a new class of citizen who I have mentioned off and on during the show, the freedman. The freedman enjoyed limited rights within the empire, and was never mistaken for a full citizen, but for the most part, aside from the casual sneers directed their way for their servile origins, freedmen could reasonably hope to become fully functional and often prominent members of society. When the freedman was released from his formal bondage, though, it did not free him from obligation to his former master. The old rules of client and patron still defined Roman daily life, which we'll get to a bit later. And a freedman naturally became the faithful client of his old master, further adding to that master's prestige. During the Republic, freedmen were restricted in what they could be and do once they were free. But by the reign of Claudius, most of those restrictions had been lifted, and Claudius himself set a precedent by stocking the imperial bureaucracy with educated ex-slaves who had the capacity to perform the mundane tasks of empire without the haughty disdain for clerical grunt work shown by free citizens. But once free Romans realized how much power such clerical grunt work afforded these lowly ex-slaves, they began to agitate for reform, and Domitian seized the opportunities